All right. Thank you, Scotty. And welcome, everyone. It's really an honor to moderate this CABC Entrepreneur Circle Forum on building back better in North American infrastructure. And I can tell you we are just extremely fortunate to have as our featured guest for this discussion, Laurie Mahon. And she has to be one of the most knowledgeable, experienced infrastructure executives globally. And if you'll just indulge me for a couple of minutes to give a proper introduction to Laurie and share a little bit what I know about her background before she gives us some opening remarks, and then we open this up for questions and discussion. It might surprise you, but Laurie started out with a graduate degree from the design school at Harvard, so it wasn't an MBA straight to McKinsey. Her first role, as I recall, was at the Port Authority of New York. And following that, she went into infrastructure investment banking at Credit Suisse. And I think she could share some pretty fun stories about her title as Queen of Trash. She became a partner in McKinsey's infrastructure practice. And that was where I had the privilege of connecting with her. And I remember trying to convince the president and vice president of Costa Rica that they needed to improve their transportation infrastructure. And I especially remember the names of the President Chinchilla and Vice President Lieberman, which I wasn't expecting. But she also has led the CIBC's Global Infrastructure and Power Group, and now is vice chair of CIBC among her many, many roles in business. It's just such a pleasure to introduce to you all for this discussion on building back better, Laurie Mahon.
Thank you, Jay. That's a lovely introduction. I'm going to hire you to do that for me in the future. Because by doing it the way you did, you couldn't let everyone know that I'm really 87 years old. Because I usually do things like say, I've been in this business for 40, and then I catch myself thinking, oh, wait, people can do math in this crowd. So we'll not go there. Let's just say that it's been a very long career in infrastructure. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about how I got here, because I think it is it shapes my perspective. My dad was a civil engineer. He served in the Merchant Marine in World War II and came back and went to Penn State and got his degree in civil engineering and worked for the Erie-Lackawanna Railroad as superintendent of construction. And then in 1965 went out on his own with a partner and started a construction company that built railroad track sidings. So our family dinner table conversation, 5 kids, my stay-at-home mom and my dad, every night consisted of talking about construction and talking about railroads and talking about labor and talking about how to get things done. So it was probably no surprise as I kind of grew up. I spent summers working in his office, working up track bids. I can still tell you how to price railroad track and 5B ballast and all kinds of good things like that. But my world began to change as I went off to college and then to graduate school and thought, there's more to this than just building stuff. There's the public policy part of all of it, and there's the thinking about what we should build. And at one point in my life, I was a journalist, and I actually wanted to grow up to become Ada Louise Huxtable. For those of you who are too young to know who Ada Louise Huxtable is or was, she was the premier architectural writer in North America. The Canadians might say Jane Jacobs was, but I would say she was more a policy person. But Ada wrote about architecture and the built environment for the New York Times and really shaped my way of thinking about the world. So I have indeed spent my entire career in infrastructure. I have been a public servant. I worked for both the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey Transit, where I was for 5 years, leaving as deputy CFO. I've been an investment banker. I've worked for McKinsey. I've had my own consulting firm. I've been a principal in a construction company. And I have actually been a developer myself. So I always joke that I've sat at all 5 corners of the table and tend to look at the infrastructure world from that perspective. And from that perspective, it all looks pretty grim right now. There's not one seat at that table that looks really good. And I'm not by definition a pessimist. I'm a realist, and so I would love to have a realistic conversation today about what people say and what they mean, and how none of that seems to ever result in anything really getting done or changing. And what we as a group of senior industry and business leaders and policymakers can do to have a different conversation. Because I think that the issue that we face collectively, Canada and the US and all of our neighbors, quite honestly, is that we have taken what should be a policy discussion. We sometimes make it a project discussion, which is what Canada has done. But in the US, we've made it a political discussion. And we have, and those are the three P's that forget public-private partnership. The three P's should be policy, projects, and politics, but we have often forgotten about two of them and only think about politics. What's happening in the US Congress now around the infrastructure bill is what happens every time there's an infrastructure bill. It starts off high and mighty, very lofty ideas. It ends up looking like a Christmas tree with everyone's ornaments strung on it. Then the other side of the aisle takes and starts shooting off people's ornaments, and pretty soon the tree catches fire and nothing ever happens. My prediction on what's going to happen with this infrastructure bill is the same thing that has happened on the last five, which is not a whole hell of a lot is going to change. And I, again, don't mean that to be pessimistic, but I think that's realistic. In Canada, we have an election coming up. Everyone running has talked, and even some of those not running have talked about infrastructure as the savior of the Canadian economy. I think we all are smart enough to know that it's not. It certainly can prop up jobs. It can create economic momentum. It can actually infrastructure focus can even sometimes change communities and bring a different tenor to a discussion about how we should take care of our communities. But it doesn't change the world. But it is good to hear that everyone is talking about it. When we talk about Canada, and I'm going to continue to jump back and forth if that's okay. When we talk about Canada, we really have to talk at the provincial level more than at the federal. At the provincial level, we have a couple of provinces, I think, doing some really interesting things on the project level. Certainly, Ontario has been very forthcoming with a large number of transportation projects. Quebec continues to advance both transportation and energy projects. And BC, continues along the path of trying to kind of balance green investment and economic growth. Alberta's kind of sticking its toe in the water, trying to figure out what it can do, and has floated some trial balloons on some interesting projects. How all that gets paid for is a topic for another day, always, which is why things don't get built, because having the conversation about how you pay for all this probably needs to predate the conversation around what we're going to build. Flipping back across the border to the United States, the Biden Build Back Better, whatever it's called this week, program has passed the House in a form that looks like a very traditional infrastructure bill, although it's got a few things in it that you wouldn't have expected to have seen, most notably some climate change resilience spending, which is quite interesting. Much more money for Amtrak than anyone ever saw. Thank you, Joe Biden, a loyal Amtrak rider. And certainly a little bit more focus on airports and on the electric grid than we've ever seen before. But what's going to happen to that bill in the Senate is anyone's guess. This whole debate about tying that bill to a larger reconciliation bill, which includes all kinds of social infrastructure, which is what the progressives are trying to do. I'm not a politician. I don't want to predict outcomes, but it just from reading the press from all corners of the table, it doesn't appear that anyone thinks that that's going to work very well. So we'll see what happens there. Against that background, however, I will say something very positive, which is good. I'm kind of glad the politicians are screwing this all up, because in the meantime, the private sector has stepped into the void here. And I think that what's the debate that I would like to happen among us, the discussion, is what can we do to have this debate around infrastructure spend and infrastructure investment at a level that includes more than just the politicians. Because we have, unfortunately, that the politicians dominate the debate to the point where legitimate private investment doesn't even have a seat at the table in the debate, but is kind of left sitting on the sidelines waiting for what the bill is going to say and saying, oh, please give me a piece of it. But the reality is, while all that's going on, we're raising billions and billions of dollars. Infrastructure funds are raising billions of dollars. Pension funds have trillions of dollars that they are ready, willing, and able to invest in infrastructure. So in some ways, we've talked about the political side of it. I know that's the topic of this, but I'm going to take that topic and park it off to the side for a moment, and talk about things that are perhaps a little more positive and a little bit more entrepreneurial. I love the fact that the name entrepreneur is in the name of this group. So I think having a conversation around what can one be entrepreneurial about when one thinks about infrastructure, and how should one think about the kinds of infrastructure investment that are really needed and that are really ripe for private investment and private return on capital and private management and private attention to detail. Because I think the one thing both countries have in common is that government projects, as they come out of infrastructure spending, tend to be short-term in nature. There tends to be a desire to create jobs instantaneously, so they tend to focus on shovel-ready projects. Since most major infrastructure projects take between 20 and 30 years to go from planning into the ground, there are very few game-changing shovel-ready projects out there. Most of them are kind of maintenance projects. So no matter what happens on either side of the border with an infrastructure spending bill, this need to actually envision a future state, to look at what we might need to actually run our companies and our country and our economies in 20 years and 30 years, which is what we should be thinking about today, I think remains a topic that needs to be grasped a little more firmly by a combination of public and private interests, and that business should drive much of that conversation, based on businesses certainly being at the mercy of a failure of government to have foreseen things like the logistics nightmare we're all living through, and the supply chain issues, which are very much an outcome of not having invested in the proper place in the transportation network. So hopefully that's a lot to think about, Jay. I'm going to turn it back to you to see where you want to take me.
Well, thank you, Laurie, and for kicking this off. And I do want to make sure that we have a wonderful group of participants here, that they feel free to ask questions in the time we have remaining in this session. That's why we're assembled. But I will kick it off with just following up on something you said. Given these dynamics on each side, of the U.S.-Canadian border, what would you see where the policymakers seem to be frozen in place, and so chronically we are in this situation where we feel that so much needs to be done but is not advancing, and here we have let me stop there. We'll get back to the policy side. What do you see as the most exciting areas or opportunities within the infrastructure space, Canada and U.S., for entrepreneurs, for people, to
Sure.
come in and make a difference?
I think there's three areas. The first is digital infrastructure. I think in some ways that's the easiest mountain to scale, in that much of the investment to date in digital has been private investment. And so I think there's a good legacy there of trying to keep government out of it, and using government to help us do things like create linear networks and provide subsidy to being able to serve disadvantaged communities in northern Canada and last mile into urban areas and all that. But we don't necessarily need government to kind of take over projects and issue RFPs and tell us who gets to build them. I think the private sector has shown itself willing to do it. The financial markets have been willing to back them, but they could use a little bit of government support in terms of both the regulatory side and the kind of, if you will, the project promotion side, the ability to actually get projects built and done. The second, I think, is the whole energy transition piece, which is massive. Different in different parts of North America. Parts of Canada look like the US in this. And, I would say, kind of the Calgary, Alberta, Houston, Oklahoma, confluence are all facing one set of issues. The coasts are facing different sets of issues. And again, kind of the more rural, remote communities are facing yet another set of issues. But all of them collectively are looking into a future where a reliance on pulling fossil fuel out of the ground, transporting it, and using relatively unsophisticated combustion technologies to burn it to create energy is going to be a thing of the past. Now, whether that happens by 2030 or 2050 or all of this insane debate about how many degrees and when's it going to happen, I mean, to me, a lot of that obscures the very necessary conclusion that it is going to happen and that the negative effects of it have already happened, and whether we slow them or we stop them is almost irrelevant, because we're already seeing that the results of this have changed our weather patterns, have caused coastal flooding, have made certain places less habitable, and oh, by the way, are making other places more habitable. So there's a whole bunch of stuff around energy transition that we can dive into depending on how people are interested. And then I think the last is the supply chain. And I think there's two elements on supply chain management. One is, and this may not mean as much to the Canadians, but I think to the Americans it will. When I first came to New York, it was now I'm going to absolutely tell you how old I am. It was 1976 when I first got out of Harvard. And the young lawyers I knew who were coming to New York were all being snapped up by the big New York law firms. And Jay, you're too young to remember this, but they were all going to work on a landmark case, which was the breakup of AT&T, which engaged probably, I don't know how many thousands of young lives for a decade in this landmark antitrust case that the U.S. took on, which was to break up AT&T because it was a monopoly. Mm-hmm. And I find that I do nothing but chuckle when I look out my little rural street here in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and I see nothing but an army of Amazon trucks going up and down the street, delivering every single thing that I need and that I buy. And I think, wait a minute, what's the difference between what we did 50 years ago and where we are today, or 45 years ago? We've now got this behemoth that is controlling, not just almost 50% of all commerce in the United States right now, but increasingly more and more ownership in the logistics and supply chain. They are owning the trucks that are delivering it. They are buying airports. They are trying to buy into railroads. I mean, it is an astonishing intrusion into the logistics chain, and everyone seems to be okay about it, except when it breaks, which it has over the last year. And so I think when we look at the supply chain issues, they are intrinsically, I think, difficult to unravel, because it is everything from policy and political questions, those other two P's again, about who should really do this. But then it's a question of how. So on one hand, we're talking about trying to be more mindful about using energy and fossil fuel. And at the other, we've created this incredibly expensive and fuel consuming system where you get 6 deliveries a day of things worth 5 cents each on 6 different trucks. And how do you make all that come together in your head? So those are the 3 areas that I think that are ripe for private entrepreneurship, for private investment, and for a new kind of policy conversation.
Jay, I just wanted to jump in, if I could, for
yes.
just a minute. This is such a wonderful discussion, and just wanted to welcome former Premier Brad Wall. You can't see him, but the icon of a phone is Brad Wall. So his, when we use Teams, he can come in, but when we use Cisco, his computer has a revolt. So before we slag politicians and recovering politicians too much, I wanted to just make everybody aware that the former premier is on, and he's a member of our advisory board. But anyway, and there are so many interconnections here. I saw Lena Trudeau, the co-chair of the Entrepreneur Circle, nodding when you were talking about Amazon, and Lena, of course, came to us from AWS, and so there are all sorts of relationships. Anyway, I just wanted to welcome Brad and jump in with that, Jay.
Okay, thank you so much. We're delighted he's joined us. Laurie, I think your comments focusing on for entrepreneurs to be thinking about impacts, digital infrastructure and energy transition, and it is certainly the case that energy and communications infrastructure have been more open and largely driven by the private sector and regulated at the public level. And there's certainly been enormous innovation and change in both of those sectors in last decades, and the pace of change is quickening. So I certainly appreciate you pointing those out. I wonder if we have anyone on participating here that would like to ask a follow-up question, more specifics about those areas.
Well,
I have a question
to make observations. So, Lena, if you were about to talk, go ahead, and then Zach, maybe you could talk a little bit about the energy projects you've worked on. Anyway, Lena.
That would be great. And
Okay.
and look, I don't. If there are more sort of urgent questions than mine, I'm happy to take a back seat. I'll just tell you though, my question is, I'm fascinated by this notion that government isn't necessarily so much intentionally withdrawing from infrastructure, but is just seeming to find itself incapable of handling it. And I think the private sector, I'm a huge fan, right, of private sector investment in infrastructure. However, we all know that government has a role when infrastructure investments that need to be made that don't have a readily apparent return on that investment. And I wonder if you could just maybe speak a little bit to, are there any areas where you're particularly concerned about government's inability to fulfill their role here?
Sure. And I'm going to have to tie a couple of thoughts together. So give me a second to background this for you. My graduate degree is in transportation planning. And it was a interesting degree a long time ago where it was kind of half engineering and half policy. And we learned all kinds of things about how do you build roads and transit systems and all that kind of stuff. I assure you, if I went back to MIT tomorrow, I would learn the same things. Not much has happened in the way of how we think about highways and how we think about transit systems. They are fixed route. Transit systems are fixed schedule. They go from A to B. There's an assumption that people go from home to work. And then maybe some days of the week, they might go to a recreational facility or to a Blue Jays game or something. And so you might adjust your schedule, but that's kind of how things are planned. Highways are things where trucks and cars get on and they drive at high rates of speed. They might be willing to pay a little more money to drive at a higher rate of speed, i.e. a toll road or a managed lane. But effectively, we haven't really changed the way we think of those assets. And yet, the technology exists that we could fundamentally change the way we both plan, design, and use those assets. So, for example, the concept of a digital highway, where you effectively can respond in almost instantaneous time to changing demand or changing travel patterns or such. It exists. The UK is converting the M4 to a digital highway. We're not even thinking about that in North America. The concept of taking fixed route, fixed scheduled transit and kind of focusing it more through a sophisticated signaling system into an on-demand system where you don't have to have the same kind of train consists throughout the day, going the same places, making the same stops, all of which become more responsive. that overlay of, and this is, I told you this was a long introduction, so I apologize, but that overlay of new technology onto existing assets is where I think government is missing the boat. Because what government does fine is they replicate what's already in place. And I'm not being judgmental or negative about it. It is an outcome of a planning process that takes 20 years. So when you start, envisioning a project, when you're a young highway engineer, it's going to take you 20 years to get that first shovel in the ground. That's just the way it is. By the time you do the environmental work and the community participation and you put the bid out and then you do all of that, that is the average life of a mega project. The ability to weave new technology into that is very difficult in the context of way government promotes projects. And so when you have a stall in government funding, and those projects now take 30 years to get done, which is what's happened in the United States.
Yeah.
The Gateway Tunnel project in New York, which is to replace the aging tunnel between New Jersey and New York, which is the only link connects it, by the way, has been, I did work on that project at New Jersey Transit in 1978. Same project.
Yeah.
It's
for the
insane.
Laurie, is that
So
for the Lincoln
that's my
Tunnel?
issue.
The Hudson River Tunnel.
Hudson River Tunnel.
Hudson River Tunnel. Okay. Goodness.
The one
That's
that almost broke
fascinating.
during Sandy.
Thank you very much, Laurie. I really appreciate your comments.
Thanks, Lena.
Well,
Hi, Laurie. Neil. Oh, was Smale about to speak?
Zachary,
Is it my turn?
you're breaking up, I'm afraid.
Hold on. Can you hear me now?
Yes, much better.
Okay. Hi, Laurie. How are you? I went off video just so I could you could hear me better. But real quick background on myself. I was previously the vice chairman and CEO of Cedar LNG, which is the currently the largest indigenous majority-owned infrastructure project in Canada. About $2.5 billion LNG project. And we recently sold our interest to Pembina Pipeline Corporation about 4 months ago. So I'm not taking it yet, so I'll keep the name out of it for right now. But I'm soon to join as an executive to a publicly traded green hydrogen company. So the energy transition was very timely and close to home. So I had a specific question around policy. So again, a lot of what I've been reading kind of resonates with what you were saying and kind of what I've been hearing on a lot of the subsidies or kind of ways to accelerate energy transition was focused mainly on the revenue side, right? So subsidizing utilities, subsidizing the agreements to make them more profitable, more money in the contracts. The area where I see kind of lacking, especially, and it goes with what you were just saying on the long-term planning and how slow it is to kind of sometimes move the government policies, is on the technology side, right? So being at CIBC, you would if I went to you to underwrite a project and provide me bank financing, where I see kind of a gap right now is on the technology risk perspective. So on one hand, you want to promote new green, energy transition technologies, but there doesn't seem to be either policy support or just like that kind of subsidy support to provide you, some kind of a de-risking element to backstop the construction of these projects. Do you see anything changing on that, or see anything kind of just on the policy front to kind of further accelerate and promote, emerging technologies?
That's a whole bunch of great questions wrapped up in there. Let me see if I can unpack.
Sorry.
They're all good questions, and I think I can answer them all. Whether I remember them all or not is another question. But,
okay.
let me unpack it a little bit. So, you raise a really interesting question, which is, and let me put it on kind of a higher scale for the moment, and then come back down, which is, what is the role of governments and financial institutions in promoting new technologies? And I think to answer that question, you have to think about, how are banks regulated, and what do governments expect banks to do? Well, governments expect banks not to lose money, and they expect banks to kind of lend money at a reasonable rate. Therefore, banks cannot charge big interest rates because they get regulated by the government. All of that is a way of saying banks are the worst place in the world to raise money for new technologies, because it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit with what banks are supposed to do. However, the financial community is ripe with opportunity to fund development, whether it's technology or development projects. And certainly what we see, because we're not just a bank, we're also an investment bank, and we're also a fund manager of funds. We see that over the last decade, certainly, there's been an awful lot of private capital attracted to new technologies and infrastructure through a couple of different mechanisms. One, through some very specific venture capital funds. We can say what we want about venture capital and how much money they take off the top from owners, but on the other hand, they're taking pure risk. So we can debate whether it's a good number or a bad number, but they are the guys who kind of first come into the market right at the highest risk level, and are willing to put up a lot of capital with no security to try to make something work. As that begins to progress, and you kind of get to round 2 and round 3, what we're certainly seeing, and the Canadian market has really been fantastic for this, particularly the Vancouver Stock Exchange. We're seeing that some of the public stock exchanges, Toronto and Vancouver in particular, and in the US, NASDAQ through the SPAC process, that there are ways for young technology companies without proven revenue track records to go public and raise money from public shareholders. So that's another path. And then the adjacent path, of course, is to raise it from funds, from infrastructure funds, all of whom do have baskets for kind of early stage stuff. Now, then as you progress along and you get to be a little bit more tried and true, if you will, and you've got a demonstration project, we've successfully raised capital from pension funds and from the big infra funds for greenfield new technology projects, provided that the technology has been vetted by, engineering firms and universities and such, wherever it's appropriate, that the technology works. So it's not all doom and gloom. When you ask the role of government there, my goal of government in that is to stay out of the way. In other words, don't over-regulate it. Don't put too many restrictions on it. Let the market kind of develop these technologies. And if government decides they want to set up some incubator funds or such, great, but try to do it without a whole lot of strings attached. I hope that's answered some of your questions.
No, it did. Thank you. I guess maybe just one follow-up. Do you see kind of, looking out to the future a little bit with the crystal ball, do you see the promotion from government being still on the tax incentive side, like tax equity, or do you see it more on guaranteed payments? I know there's a bunch of stuff that's being talked about, and specific in the U.S. side in the reconciliation package.
So one of the issues with there's two issues with trying to subsidize things through tax equity or tax benefits. One is that those laws tend to last one administration at the most, or one Congress, which is 2 years at the least. And it is and because you can't take advantage of those until projects are put in service. And given the development time and lead time of projects, you can't rely on tax equity as a funding mechanism to get your project built. You can only rely on it once the project is built to kind of pay you back some of your equity. So there's a timing issue and there's a risk issue with doing it just through tax benefits. We've certainly seen the solar industry kind of go like this as the conversation around tax equity has changed under different political administrations in the States. The solar industry has the shortest construct time of any of the renewables. I mean, it's typically 8 months to put up a typical solar array. So those guys have actually been okay But when you start talking about wind, or you start talking about biomass, or you start talking about hydrogen, where you're going to have a much longer development time, we still have to bridge the timing gap about when you can use tax equity. That's number one. Number two is, unless things change dramatically, which who knows if they will, the tax equity only works if you have corporations who pay a lot of taxes, who are willing to invest in projects with tax equity. And we don't see that. The average corporate tax rate in America, paid, not charged, paid, is under 6%. So the tax equity is rather worthless. And so what you're seeing is that you don't have the big bucket of corporate taxpayers who are going to dump trillions of dollars into these. And we've seen the tax equity market shrink over the last few years as more developers have tried to take advantage of it. So although it works, I think it's got a lot of issues, and I would prefer that government come up with better ways to do it, whether it is, I'm not a great fan of direct subsidies, only because of the administrative part of it. I don't have a political issue with it. I just find it's difficult to administer. But whether it can be through tax holidays, perhaps, that help developers, whether it is kind of, ways to not, some states, for example, exempt developers on sales tax on capital goods, that if you're putting it in renewables, that can save you 8% on a project. That's pretty amazing. So I think there may be some other ways. I don't think a lot of attention's been paid to that, but it would be fun to get a little more creative around it.
Laurie, would you say it's fair to say there are trillions of dollars in need in infrastructure spending across Canada and the U.S., and there are trillions of dollars assembled in the private sector to be deployed? Isn't it the job of the policymakers in Ottawa and Washington to help unlock that potential and get the job done? And
yeah, look, I think it was Lena who mentioned it, but I think one of the issues that we've always had when we have this debate is, do we make projects affordable to all, or do we make projects that the market can price and we then subsidize the user? I mean, it's a fundamental decision to be made, right? It's funny. We could have a whole other conversation on P3s in Canada and why they have failed and why Canada has moved away from that model. But the real simple answer is 407. It's only one answer, right? And that is because the general construct of most people in Canada who think about that project is that they gave away the golden goose and everyone's been paying for it ever since. And whether that is true or not, whether that happened because it was a poorly structured project, or the economy just bloomed in such a way, whatever the answer is, a lot of money was given away to the private sector that people rightfully felt should have been used to do things like reduce tolls or create other assets in that community. If you rethink the pricing model of public assets, and this is, I think, one of the fundamental decisions that I think has to be made in both countries, is, again, are you going to subsidize the user directly, or are you going to try to kind of create a revenue profile that is such that accessible to all? And why is this important? The New York City subway system, on the average pre-pandemic day, 30% of its trips were by children going back and forth to school who did not pay a fare, because it was deemed to be socially important that those kids got a free ride to school. And because New York City Board of Education doesn't have school buses and stuff, they put them on the subway, which means that every rider of the MTA, every rider of the New York City subway, is effectively subsidizing those school kids. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong, but when you do the math and then you kind of add in the senior citizen fares and you kind of look at that and you say, what have we done here? We've said that I used to joke that Nelson Rockefeller could take the bus in New York at a senior citizen fare, even though he could have bought and sold the MTA 17 times. Is that really what we want to do? So I think rethinking how do we build things? Do we build a system that works and then figure out a fair way to charge? And if you can't afford it, we find a way to creatively subsidize you. I would like to have that debate, but it's a very tough debate to have. No one wants to talk about that one. I've been trying to have that debate for 30 years.
We may have a couple of policymakers on this in this session, and we invite them to speak up at this point while we've digressed back to the policy side.
It's the 3P: policy, projects, and politics.
Yeah. And we heard you loud and clear that the politics have been undermining the first two. Certainly, we've got some dysfunctional politics, especially on the southern side of the border.
Yes, I would argue that is correct. So you want to talk about a place where strong policy has worked, though. I want to tie a couple of thoughts together. And this is a U.S. example, but if you think about and this is kind of picking up on some of the stuff Zach has talked about a little bit. If you think about where a strong federal policy has worked in light with new technology and with a desire to get things done, it's offshore wind in the U.S. I think you can actually point to the very rapid development of offshore wind in the U.S. As being, I think, being a success story, where you had some appropriate federal policies in place. You had a FERC ruling and a FERC process that made sense, and that was kind of streamlined. You had a willingness to look at new technologies that had never been used in the U.S., which is rare that ever happens. And you had enough of a role given to the states that they could feel important, but not enough of a role that they could screw it up. And so that the big global players felt that they weren't having to come into 50 markets. They kind of actually had a singular market in the US. Now, obviously early days, but the amount of interest and the amount of investment that's pouring in on offshore wind, I think, is really quite remarkable. And I think there are some really good lessons to be taken out of that success story.
Well, certainly, I guess, Laurie, what you're saying too is that the policymakers, not just with the power, it's not simply the power of the Treasury and putting money into infrastructure, but it's creating, the environment in which people can make decisions and go forward with projects. So a lot of it is, and so, do you have any advice for, our entrepreneurs who are in this call, saying, should they, as opposed to, sitting on the sidelines, I guess you're saying, look, there's some mega trends here in sustainable infrastructure and in this energy transition. That's not going away regardless of what the policymakers do or don't do. They can accelerate because they could do some things. They have the power in Ottawa and Washington to make it more attractive. But at the end of the day, if you're an entrepreneur and you're innovative and you see an opportunity in the sustainable infrastructure space, there's a good chance there's a market for it. I guess, and similarly in getting in this rapidly evolving, digital infrastructure space, there's a lot of opportunity. Regardless, it can be helped by what people in Ottawa and Washington do, and in provincial and state capitals. But for the most part, this is a B2B opportunity, and that's where you see opportunity.
It is, and there's a common thread among all the three things that I pointed out that I think is worth pulling on a little bit, and that is that those are all areas where government doesn't feel that it has embedded expertise. Governments feel like they know how to build roads. They certainly feel like they know how to operate transit systems. They know how they think they know how to operate airports, although we'd argue, I think in North America, that's probably not true.
Right.
But they don't think they know anything about digital infrastructure or energy or supply chain management and that. So very often, if I'm talking to a client about thinking about where do I want to invest my resources, I will always guide them to something where government isn't going to feel that it's got a bunch of 60-year-old white guys who are sitting there saying, but I know how to do that. I don't need you to tell me how to do it better. And that is one of the issues we run into when we talk about transportation, right? Because you've got these massive departments of transportation with thousands of employees who are threatened by somebody coming in and telling them how to do it better and smarter. So I, just kind of something to tuck into your head as you're thinking about it is if the governmental client has to hire a consultant to understand what you're saying, that's probably a good thing.
Let me see if we have a few questions because we're going to run out of time soon. So I want to encourage our participants to take advantage of this great opportunity with Laurie.
Jay, actually, hi. I have my hand up. Laurie, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jen Sloan. I chair the CABC board, and in my day job, I'm with MasterCard based here in Toronto. I'm fascinated by your comments on digital infrastructure. It's music to my ears. But to your point, government, I'm not sure, knows how to tackle this. And so in that apprehension,
Yes.
I'm just wondering, do you have any suggestions on quick wins? The quick wins that would show that this makes sense, it's the right thing to do, which will kind of put, the government at ease that this can work, makes sense, we can progress forward. I'm just wondering if you could provide any direction in that regard.
So I think there are a couple of ones where you can think about. You guys may have heard that there have been a couple of land registry, P3s done in Canada, and there's been a bunch of them done in Australia and stuff. Well, what's a land registry? A land registry is basically just a digital record of who owns what and what are they doing with it, right? And the processing of the paperwork that goes around it. It doesn't seem very important, doesn't seem very sexy, but when you think of it, because governments tax land and its use, the willingness to actually turn over the management of that to a private company is astonishingly forward thinking. Take that example and carry it forward. Why can't MasterCard, for example, take over the back office collection of utility bills, sewer bills, tax bills, all of that? You guys know how to do that better than anybody. Why couldn't you then digitize that? Why couldn't you then connect that through a system with the utility?
Oh.
Right at the brilliant moment, we lost
it. Just getting to the,
Hi, Jennifer. Hang on. Laurie will make it back.
No problem.
Speaking of digital infrastructure and the need for innovation and entrepreneurship.
Yeah, where there's a need for innovation and where you have this, I think that's an interesting intersection.
Great. Thank you for those thoughts.
Laurie, we may have lost your last, minute or two of your comments. You were just talking about how MasterCard, why can't MasterCard take over the back office of utility bills? And right at that moment, we lost you. So maybe you could repeat the last thing, your last few sentences.
I'm sorry. I did notice my bandwidth was getting wonky. Is it okay now?
It's good now. Yeah.
Yes.
What I was saying is that if you think about all of the things that the private sector already does and does so well, governments are still stumbling along with paper files and with all of this kind of arcane technology. And it just strikes me that the kinds of baby steps that we've seen through the land registry privatizations, right? If you start rolling those out to the rest of government and you start thinking about being able to create this much more efficient big data background for government. So data when I was at McKinsey, we spent a lot of time thinking about big data and its value. And what we realized was that some of the best data in the world is collected by governments, but they don't even know they have it. They don't know what to do with it, and it's not organized. And if you actually took the desire for big data and you coupled that with the need of governments to actually collect and track things, you probably could create a business pretty easily that would be profitable and would take costs out of government and create all of this data that all of us desperately want to know.
Well, I know we're starting to approach the end of the program, so I'm going to just ask you, Laurie, what question should we have asked you? And please feel free to answer it.
The one question I wish you would all ask yourselves is, am I doing enough to talk to my political leaders in my government about the kind of world I want to live in and I want my kids to live in? That's
Well,
my question
that's
for
what
all
we
of you.
do all the time, Laurie. So I'm glad you asked that because you know, the Canadian
Because
American
that
Business
I
Council
think many of us do
exists to
not,
it.
and that is the question we need to keep asking. We are planning for a future world. We're not trying to replicate 1976.
Well, you know, I wish we had a lot more time because, you know, you have such a depth and breadth of experience. We could ask you about anything, and and it would be fun to ask about some of the projects you most enjoyed advancing during your career, what you're looking forward to, all those kinds of things. So maybe we can try again.
Anytime.
I want to thank you so much for your time today. And in doing a little bit of my homework for this, I stumbled on an article where somebody had written about you, and they quoted you on your life rules in that particular article. I don't know if you remember this one, but they said, and they attributed to you 3 life rules: one, be memorable; a second one, be generous of spirit; and a third, make interactions count. And I would certainly say today you helped us with all those life rules. And you know, on behalf of Scotty Greenwood, our executive director, Jennifer Sloan, thank you so much for being here ahead of our CABC board. But Lena Trudeau, my co-chair of the Entrepreneurs Circle, and all the members of the circle and our invited guests, who's just you know, we're grateful for your time. And I know we all do want to build back better, not the same. We want to build back better in North America.
Exactly.
And, so hopefully some entrepreneurial spirit can help in that regard.
Well, this has been delightful. It's been great meeting you all. I love being on calls like this with people who I know have the ability to change things. And so, you know, it's, and yes, those are my life rules. And I do remember that article. Although I will never forgive that author for outing me on my attempt to drink scotch in Scotland.
All right. Well, very good. And I guess, you know, Scotty, do you have some parting comments?
Well, I just want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank you, Jay and Lena, for your leadership. I want to thank you, Laurie, and I also want to thank Desiree, who makes it all happen for all of us. So thanks, everybody. Really
Great.
appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Nice meeting you.
All right.
Thank you. Thanks so
Cheers.
much.
Well.